Hello everyone, my name is Efthimios Papatsikis. You can call me Timos. I'm here in Oslomet. I joined Oslomet in February, so some of you might have seen me around. Most of you, I guess, you haven't seen me around yet. I'm very happy that I'm able to present in this course my specialization and my thoughts about infants and the brain development, which is actually my specialization in research and work in general. What I do as an associate professor in Oslomet is that I study the infant brain development, and then I try to translate this kind of information into educational practices, strategies, and pedagogies. So the set of these two lectures you're about to attend focus exactly on this path of brain development and education as well combined. And for this first presentation, I would like for us to discuss the brain development in kindergartens and how we understand this kind of approach that has to do with embedding this kind of knowledge in the kindergarten education and obviously benefit from it. So the idea of these two different presentations has to do with first of all discussing how do children develop, how we understand development in general, and what are the basic concepts we need to follow in order to understand this kind of development. These are simple information I'm about to share. Nothing very technical, but I'll try to approach and give you the idea of why, first of all, it's important to understand brain development in this very first parts of the educational process. And of course, it will give you, I hope, a bigger picture, if I may say, to understand why everything we do in education is done the way it's done, obviously, and why we may need to develop it towards a certain direction, or why we need to understand it towards a certain direction. Now, the second part of this specific idea that I'm going to share, and obviously that will be shared during the second presentation later on, will have to do with the developmentally appropriate practice and what it is developmentally appropriate practice, and how we understand the basic considerations that encompass the developmentally appropriate practice into education and our practice in the kindergartens. So, specifically, I would like to start by putting on the table this hugely debated subject that has to do with nature and nurture. So, let's clarify first of all these terms. Nature refers to the innermost biological circle of influence, which includes genes. So, just to make it a bit simpler, this idea, nature has to do with everything that refers to our inside, obviously, and it has to do with how our biological mechanisms create development in general. Now, nurture, on the other side, refers to all circles beyond ourselves, beyond the learner, if we point out to education in this case, and includes the parent-child relationships, for example, peer interaction, school experiences, culture, everything that has to do with the environment around the learner. So, why is it important to understand these two different terms? I believe it's important because this is a long-going debate that exists in education. What works, what is that doesn't work, how we can actually create understandings based on these two different topics and these two different subjects. And obviously, there might be a lot of opinions around it. So I decided to focus first on this debate to clarify it in a way and tell you that there are a lot of people around the world, a lot of scientists around the world, so now and in the past, that they actually try to understand the balance between the two, between nature and between nurture. And I would say the dominant approach that creates this kind of understanding between the two can be seen through the bioecological model that actually rejects this kind of severe debates between nature and nurture, obviously. And it says that both of them they coexist in the environment of the learner, both from the inside, as I said, and the outside, the surroundings, obviously, and they interact over time to influence the child's development. So it's paramount to understand that the dominant approach that we now know to be valid in a way is somewhere in the middle. Not one is important from the other, more important from the other, and we cannot say that one is more efficient than the other in terms of development. So seeing this kind of bioecological model into play of development, we can understand that it has several different levels to grasp in order to understand how it interacts in this specific system the child belongs to. So the first part of the system of the bioecological model can be seen as the microsystem that includes interactions, activities, and relationships of the child, and have to do with obviously the child self. And I could give you in this case an example as the mother and child relationship in this case. Then at the next level, we could see that there is the mesosystem, which is the combination of two or more microsystems, such as home and school. So, for example, you have relationships that are embedded in the microsystem of home, and this is the child and the mother, for example. But then you have the microsystem that is embedded in the kindergarten environment, and this kind of relationship may be seen between the child and the teacher. So there are abundant examples of this kind of relationships, activities we can share. I hope you can visualize some of them. So the important thing is that the more we get into this kind of specific idea of the microsystem, of the different microsystems that combined into a mesosystem, then we see that there are some relationships in between the two, between the microsystem and the mesosystem. And this is where we actually create, in the bioecological model, the exosystem. So it's not only about knowing that we have a relationship between the mother and the child, or between the teacher and the child. It's important to understand that there is a connection in between these two microsystems. So this kind of linkages, as we call it, they form the exosystem, and the more you go further out of this circle that creates the exosystem, you see that there is the macrosystem, that refers to culture, which contains specific patterns of micro, meso, and exosystem. Just to understand this explanation a bit better, I can actually give you this specific diagram that refers to all the different levels of the systems that are embedded in the bioecological model. And obviously, according to the bioecological model, the child is embedded within these different systems, and obviously it's connected increasingly to these distal sets of influences in between the different systems. So what I'm saying actually is, in simple terms, is that whatever happens in at home relates to whatever happens in school and vice versa. And then the more you go out of this system, then culture is embedded into this kind of connections that exist in between school and the domestic environment at home. And the more we see this kind of connections, the more we understand how development occurs, and the more we understand, obviously, why it's important to study development in this sense as a connecting and dynamic system that brings into our perception the different levels of this kind of systems: micro, meso, exo, and macro systems. So, just to be a bit more specific in what we are trying to analyze in terms of development and have a more practical overview of what is happening, I would like to start in terms of development by seeing the whole body, better saying seeing the body as a whole, not just the brain in this sense. So as you can see, there are different fluctuations in between how the body develops for boys and girls, obviously. And on the diagrams here, you can see that there are completely different levels of development or extensions of development for height on the one hand, and on the other hand on weight. So what I'm trying to say here is that although you see a certain trend going up in terms of the child's growth in the first 140 days of life, and that obviously continues as children get older, and it gets steeper, in the first 3 years of life. We do understand that there are fluctuations in terms of the body development, and when we understand these facts, then we need to understand that the brain obviously is impacted from this kind of fluctuations. And as a consequence, we need to understand that our practices that have to do with the educational practice and environment need to be considerate of this kind of fluctuations. And I would say that this is why it's important to study brain development, or understand at least brain development in the teaching practice, because the more we understand how the brain develops, the more we can become considerate and sensitive to changes and understand different profiles in education, and then obviously provide a better, a more efficient, if I may say, practice for the benefit of our children. So let's become a bit more specific in terms of this kind of fluctuations, in terms of this kind of developmental trends that exist on the brain itself, and understand a bit of the mechanics behind this kind of explanation I just gave. So why does the brain obviously develop? How is it done in that sense? We do know, obviously, I hope, most of us, that our brains are consisted of the basic mechanisms that create thinking, create meaning, create life in ourselves, and these are the neurons. Neurons obviously are cells that they have specific features that provide our brain with the responsible energy, techniques, and processes that create the meaning and the thinking processes, and obviously development in that sense. What I would like to focus on in terms of the mechanics of the brain itself, and it's the most interesting part, obviously, in terms of development in the very first years of life that we are referring to in education, early year education, is that in the very beginning is that the myelin, and this is this purple substance, as you can see on the neuron, is the one that actually develops and is formed in the very beginning, and then develops to insulate the neurons, the axons, as we call them, that send the signals from one side of the neuron to the next one, and then obviously through the synapses, the connections in between the different neurons, we send the signal from one neuron to the next, and the more synapses we have, the more signal we send. And this is how, in a bigger picture, this is how we create, obviously, oversimplified in this case. I'm not trying to get into details. We create learning. So the more synapses we have, the more refined synapses we have, and the better equipped neurons that have more myelin, or better fitted myelin in that sense. We can actually say that more learning is happening, and better circumstances can occur, and more fertile ground can occur in order for a person to learn, if we have a positive developmental line, obviously, in terms of myelin creation and fine-tuning of neurons. Now, the neurons, as I said, they are connected with synapses in between them, and despite what is thought from most of the people, they are not physically connected. In between them, there is a gap where we see the neurotransmitters traveling, and these are the chemical compounds that travel in between the different neurons that create connections for one neuron to the next. So it's not only about how well fitted neurons we have, it's how good our chemistry is in that sense, that creates, if I may say again oversimplified, a better environment for the neurons to communicate and see something like a developmental trend in our brain development as a whole. As you can see here on the figure, in the very beginning we have fewer neurons. Then in 6 months we have even more, and then during the second year of life we create, if we may say, the upper limit. Second to the third year of life, we create the upper limit of neurons, and this is where we actually stabilize the creation of neuronal circuitry, and this is where we start refining the whole process of connecting neurons between them. So based on these mechanisms and the mechanics of the brain, as I explained them, we say that we create, obviously, the synaptogenesis starting from before birth, obviously, and it peaks around the first year or so. Then we have the refinement of the synapses, where we either keep this kind of connections between the neurons, or we burn them, literally burn them, and that's what we call pruning, because we believe that this kind of connection is not solid enough to benefit the brain, obviously, and that happens through learning processes, obviously, and we learn all the time, not only in school, obviously, we learn outside of the school. But understanding this kind of balance in between the synaptogenesis and the pruning process that comes later on in life and continues until our end, obviously, that gives us this kind of developmental line that I'm trying to explain why is important to understand. Now, the more we see for the actual synaptogenesis to occur, and according to this diagram, as you can see on an infant's brain, starting from, sorry, that's a toddler's brain, starting from age 5 up to 20, you can see that from left to right we have more synapses coming up, more neurons coming up, and represented with this blue color, we see that there is a better layer, a more refined layer of the gray matter on the brain. And obviously the gray matter is exactly the neurons I was explaining just before. So we come into this life with less gray matter, and our aim actually, especially in the first years of life, is to create gray matter and obviously refine it. And this kind of refinement, development and refinement of the gray matter into the brain, along with other obviously processes, is what we call development in that sense. And this development happens through brain plasticity, which is actually altered via experience. And experience is what we try to understand into schools, and this is why there is a connection, an important connection between the two, and why this is why we need to understand development into the school environment, into the kindergarten environment in that sense. So obviously we are not all of us the same, exactly the same. We do share general similarities like the shape, the structure, but then again, we have completely different approaches in terms of the synaptic pruning, our myelination, and we have completely different proportions, for example, in between the gray matter and the white matter. And as you can see here in this diagram, the differentiation between men and women is not huge, but it still exists. And that would be a very interesting discussion, perhaps, to describe why we see this kind of differentiations and if there is an actual behavioral effect on this kind of differentiation. I can tell you shortly now, I don't try to deviate from our subject. I can tell you that although we see structurally some differentiations, in the end, the behavioral results, they're not that far, especially for this kind of proportional relationship between the gray and the white matter. And I'm just trying here to be blunt about people asking, oh, so basically women are different from men in terms of thinking, in terms of how they approach things. No, although we see different structures and different fluctuations in the structures, in the end we get more or less the same result. And this is what we try to understand between the connection of psychology and neuroscience in general terms. So returning to what I was saying is that we do have fluctuations, we do have individual differences, and by understanding that, we need to understand why do individual differences matter, and what can they predict when we see them in the brain. So, and obviously, why is it important to understand it for us as educators? So, it's important to understand that when we have differences, individual differences in the brain and the brain development in general, then we need to expect for different activities to take place in the brain. And I can tell you that, for example, when we have this kind of individual differences, then we need to expect, for example, different stress activities that have to do with obviously the secretion of cortisol, which is the hormone that has to do with the stress response. And obviously this kind of stress reactivity that we see being different from child to child may be caused by adverse childhood experiences. So this may be created in a kindergarten, in the domestic environment, or in the exosystem and the macrosystem, as I was explaining before, outside of these safe environments. And we need to consider them whenever we try to approach development and education in this holistic point of view. Obviously, we can see individual differences impacting behavioral inhibition as well. So that means that when we see for a child to be overreactive on stress, on a stress response, then usually these children are more prone to avoid new people, events, objects. And I hope you understand that in between these different steps I just explained from the brain development and the brain mechanisms that brings individual differences for all of us, and the actual representation of these differences can be seen in hormonal secretion and obviously representation into behavior. You can understand that our response to this kind of developmental line that comes from the brain needs to be different for every child. Obviously, that's an ideal approach. What we need to understand, obviously, if we understand that this is an ideal approach, we cannot teach every child specifically as they want them to be taught, because we have them always, in a very safe environment. Yet we have more than one most of the time into this kindergarten educational environment. We need to understand what are the tools that affect this kind of different approaches in our individual mechanisms of brain development, in order to obviously create a more effective environment of education. So basically, reversing the whole idea of development and understanding the tools, first of all, we can say that one tool that actually affects brain development and predicts a differentiation in the brain development and impact brain development is the genetics. That we cannot do anything, obviously, about that up to a point. Then it's experience, that has to do obviously with brain plasticity and how the brain changes, as I explained, along the timeline of development. Then it has to do with the experience seen from a biological perspective, and that has to do with nutrition, exercise, sleep, drugs that may be impacting the different biological processes that happen into the brain and the body in general, obviously, and change the rule of the brain development as we discuss it. And then we have the social perspective, the social side of things into experience, where can be represented through attachment, stress, and a stimulated or not environment, and obviously creates differentiations on the brain development approach we try to analyze here. On that last part, I would include culture as well, because culture is embedded in social environments. And as we've seen from this kind of the analysis I presented just before on the ecobiological system model, culture eventually interacts with the other parts of the system of the model, and into the different levels of the systems create different dynamics. So to see in the end, in result, seeing different brain development trajectories. So what is the role of culture in this group diversity? If we see the educational environment as a group of people rather than just an individual, it's that whenever we operate at a level of large groups, cultures create patterns, values, beliefs, and behaviors that we share. So although up to this point I said that we are connected with our environment, be it the domestic or the educational, in one way, and this predicts different developmental lines on our brain, and this means that taking into consideration this connection in between ourselves and the environment, we need to refine pedagogies based on this kind of connection. I reverse now the idea, saying that culture and the exogenous environment outside of us, the wider environment that we get to embed ourselves since our birth and eventually into the kindergarten and school and so forth, that creates a bidirectional approach that connects ourselves and consequently our brain development to the rest of the society. So this kind of shared values, belief, institutions, and behaviors, they are communicated from generation to generation. So it means that although individually we have a specific approach on our brain development, then we share some of these lines, trajectories of development based on our communicated shared beliefs, institutions, behaviors, and values. Then it dictates in a way some physical and social contexts, And again, referring to this kind of bidirectional approach from ourselves and the outside of ourselves, nature versus nurture debate, as I was explaining it before. This is what interacts with our brain development, of course, in that sense. It affects customs on how we understand specific ideas on how we need to upbring a child. So this means different trajectories and individual differences into the brain development. Then obviously this kind of culture diversity can refer either to whole countries and to smaller subgroups. So we see a wider perspective that has different stages and different levels of impact into ourselves and the group we belong to. And of course, we can say securely that we all participate in multiple cultures. So the dynamics we receive and the different elements we receive from our surrounding environments and have to do with our brain development and individual differences that occur on the brain development trajectories. They don't come just from one environment, cultural perspective. They come from different, multiple cultures that we come across more or less in our lives, and more specifically in the very beginning of life, where our parents usually and our teachers try to expose us quite well or quite rightly to this kind of differentiations of cultures and the different dynamics they offer. So let us make it a bit more specific. I would like you to think about how different cultures and subcultures may have influenced your own experiences and beliefs and values. So think of different cultures you may have come across in your life, and think how these different cultures have influenced your own experiences and beliefs in your life. Do you think that your classmates share the same the same culture as you do? Or do you have the same identity in that sense? Do you have the same directions, or are they different? And how these impact yourselves? And obviously, can you identify ways your subcultures are different and how they are the same? Now, why am I asking these questions? I want you to try to provide some feedback to yourselves. And after doing that, try to visualize how this kind of approach, how this kind of feedback may fit as a model to your students. So it's not only us, obviously. I mean, we belong to society as teachers that change or are impacted from this kind of differentiation of cultures, and consequently we change our brains. It's our students as well that they are impacted most of all, and they get to have the biggest impact we can see via evidence and research in the educational environments and in the kindergartens more specifically. So, unfortunately, sometimes we see that in terms of the development of the child, there are some cultural mismatches that happen between the teachers and the students. And that's why I asked before these kind of questions so that you can understand or try to understand how this works bi-directionally. So it's not only what kind of cultures you have or what kind of cultures you understand to exist in your life. It's important to understand what exactly is happening in a child's developmental trajectory, and to be more precise, brain development trajectory in that sense, in the very beginning of life, in the first years of life, and how this kind of connection between you as teachers and the child and the student you have in front of you, or the students you have in front of you in the classroom, how you connect with them in terms of culture, how you disconnect from them in terms of culture, and where you can identify mismatches in your practice. Could it be in language, in closeness during conversation, for example, attention to punctuality, narrative structure of stories? So you say your stories in a different way than they try to say them, and so forth. So you always need to keep in mind that whatever you see happening in terms of culture, in terms of society that belongs to the ecosystem of the bioecological model, as I explained it before, has to do and it interacts and impacts the brain development of the young child you have in front of you. And obviously, that brings an extra level of consideration to knowing and understanding how the brain develops, because then you can understand in a deeper way how things develop during your watch, during your practice in the kindergarten. So, what are the classroom implications of culture based on all this? We need to become aware of our students' cultural capital. This is what I just explained before, what they bring with them into the kindergarten. We need to be careful that our thoughts on it, on the cultural capital, they don't lead to a deficit view that highlights what children lack. So basically, what I'm saying here is that we try to understand that what we bring into the classroom, what children bring into the classroom, and we don't try to pinpoint the problems that exist. We try to work with them so that we make them work on our benefit in that sense. Then we need to become knowledgeable about our students' language and dialects, but then we need to teach standard language because this is what is used officially in a specific country, and in this case in Norway. So this is where we need to invest more of our time rather than just trying to communicate in the different dialects, perhaps, because this is the tool that will bring more social life, will bring a better, more functional ecosystem, as I explained it before. And then we need to become aware of our students' narrative style, how they bring their lives into narration, and how they try to make us understand their lives so that we can shape them or help them shape them in the best possible way. We need to build bridges between home and the school, obviously. And based on culture, because I hear it many, many times, although we need to understand different races, different colors, we need to embrace them, obviously, we shouldn't be colorblind. Because most people say, no, I try to provide a flat line approach in what is expected from me to be my practice in terms of different cultures, races, and different approaches. What I'm saying in terms of brain development, in general, you shouldn't be colorblind because that will give you an edge on creating a more efficient approach for your students to become safer in this environment, learn more faster perhaps, and get more options to learn through their own cultures and their own perspectives that their society and their culture bring in the kindergarten, obviously. So, what are, if we bring it to the next level, we just said what are the implications of culture into the classroom. Now, considering all this together, what are the implications of brain development into classroom? If we understand what I just explained up to this point, is that we try to provide optimal experiences, obviously, and we try to reduce stress up to a certain extent so that we can balance it with productivity. We need to provide good nutrition at school and opportunities for physical activity in that sense. We need to always remember to get expert help for students with developmental problems, because although knowing some of the brain development trajectories that might happen in the child's life, that doesn't mean that we're an expert to understand where exactly it goes, this kind of developmental line or trajectory. So we definitely need an expert to help us to get into the process of refining our pedagogies. And obviously, something that I like to stress whenever I give this kind of presentations is that we always need to give children repetitive practice of important skills. to strengthen their synaptic connections. So the more we actually ask them to repeat things again and again and again, especially in the first 3 to 4 years of life, the more we give them opportunities to strengthen the connections I was referring to, both biologically, chemically, and electrically, on the neuronal level, as I was explaining before. And all this brings all together bring this kind of perception of the term that we call school readiness. So we need to be aware of brain development because that brings us a better level, a more efficient level of school readiness, where gives us the understanding that a child has a biologically based rate of transition from one state to the next, and we need to be aware of this kind of transitions. And why do we need to be aware of this kind of transitions based on the brain development approach? Because then we can actually create a more appropriate practice based on development, what we call developmentally appropriate practice. And this is an approach which actually focuses on educating children from birth to 8 years old and emphasizes the child as an active participant in learning, not just a passive receiver of knowledge. So we understand the mechanics we have in front of us, the mechanism we have in front of us in terms of brain development, in terms of body development. We understand how the different systems interact with each other in the bio-ecological model approach I explained before, and then we try to shape a more appropriate practice based on specific strategies and specific ideas that we implement during our facilitation of the educational practice into the kindergarten. So I would like to conclude this presentation by saying that brain development by itself is not just an idea of bringing up knowledge and understanding knowledge on brain development itself and becoming neuroscientists. So obviously, that's not my target, that's not my aim. It's to get us to this point to understand that knowing some things about the brain will bring us to understand better why we need developmentally appropriate practice to be embedded into the kindergarten, and how we can actually actualize it based on the norms, based on the evidence we know about brain development itself. So I would like to conclude this presentation, obviously, with these last notes. And my next presentation will give you an idea, a more specific idea, on what exactly is developmentally appropriate practice, what are the specifications of it, and how we can actualize it, how we can shape it into the kindergarten environment so that we can benefit even more ourselves and obviously the students we have along with us in this beautiful journey. So thank you very much for attending this presentation so far. If you have any questions you'd like to ask me, please don't hesitate to send me an email to the email address you can see on your screens. And I see you in my next presentation about the developmentally appropriate practice. Thank you very much.